Hello and welcome to this Voynich.Ninja web chat with Professor Stephen Bax. I'm System Administrator David Jackson, and with me is moderator Koen. How are you today, Koen?
I'm great, David. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Now, Professor Bax is a respected linguist who's currently Professor of Modern Languages and Linguistics at the UK's Open University, and he's held similar posts at other institutions across the UK. He's well known in the Voynich community for having published posts. I'm sorry, the plan just fell off the pot behind me. Never mind. Good fun. Never mind, Professor. As I was saying, the Professor is well known in the Voynich community for having published work attempting to show how certain words in the manuscript can be deciphered by mapping them to certain sound symbols. Professor, how are you today?
Fine, thank you. Nice to be here.
It's lovely to have you. Right, well, Stephen, if you don't mind me calling you that, before we get into discussing your own research, I think it would be fascinating to discuss the manuscript with a professional linguist. And I think the most obvious question to start off with revolves around the marginalia. It's the writing in an apparently Latin alphabet found on the back page and on certain pages within the codex. As you know, many attempts have been made to decipher these brief notes without any definite success, although it appears to be some sort of high medieval German. Do you think there is enough text there to be definite about a reading, and what language is this pointing to?
Well, I agree with you that the marginalia are very interesting, but of course they are secondary to the text. So, of course, later in our discussion we'll come to the text of the Voynich itself. But as for the marginalia, I think there isn't really enough to be conclusive, and people have pored over it, as you say, for a long, long time, trying to work out what's going on, with some idea that there are Germanic elements in it, but also some idea that there might be Latin elements in it. And for me, one of the most convincing interpretations of the final page is that it possibly relates to some remedy related to goats and kidneys and so on. And I find the attempt to explore it very interesting, but I think, as you implied in your question, there's nothing really conclusive yet that we can draw from it.
In fact, somewhere.
But one thing, like if you have marginalia in a normal manuscript, usually you kind of see what's going on. You see, like it's a Latin sentence, it's a German sentence, but in the Voynich you have several bits of marginalia, and all of them are problematic, if I can say so. Mm-hmm. Why would that be? I mean,
well, I think again I would like to place this in a kind of multilingual framework. Yeah. I mean, if you look at some old manuscripts, I'm thinking about the Dioscorides manuscript in the Vienna Dioscorides, which is basically a fantastic ancient herbal with incredibly beautiful pictures. And if you look at the marginalia in that, it's very multilingual. You have some in Hebrew, you have some in Latin, you have some in Arabic. It's a manuscript that's been passed around the world, right, and studied very closely by different scholars who've written things in their own note form, in their own language or even dialect. And for me, the Voynich fits that pretty well perfectly. You've got even the month names, which seem to be written in a form of Old French. And obviously somebody with their own language was looking at the manuscript and decided to write in what he or she thought were the symbols for the zodiac depictions, and therefore they wrote in their own dialect or their own version of French. Then you have other people who added certain things in German, other things in Latin. And I think the most intriguing thing, as I say, is the last page, where somebody's attempted to write several lines of script. And for me, I kind of agree with your implication, Koen, that it's a bit surprising that we can't even make much of that, because you would expect it to be several lines of script in a language that we could identify. But it does seem to be in note form, and you've got the interesting plus signs between some of the words. And it does seem to be a mixture of some sort of Latin and maybe some Germanic elements too. And most intriguing for me about that last page is that there are very definitely some elements, I think there are two words, of Voynich script within the text. Yeah, and that exactly. I think is really significant for me, because that implies that it was somebody who could actually understand the Voynich script and the language behind it, but who was trying to write something, as I see it, possibly some sort of recipe of some sort of remedy of some sort. But they actually referred to Voynich words using Voynich script as well. And I mean, that, okay, could be a hoax, you never know, but that is a quite interesting mixture of languages, which again, we must understand that very many medieval scholars were multilingual, and they could switch quite easily from one language, say German, to a language such as Latin, which is more readily understood elsewhere. And if we take that text to be some sort of some notes from some scholar or other who knew several different languages and also could read the Voynich script and language, then therefore it becomes a really intriguing text. But as you hinted at the beginning, still we can't really decipher it or decode it, even that, with any great certainty.
Exactly. Now, in your answer, you mentioned also the month names that have been written on the roundels.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some people say it's a northern French dialect. Other people say it's Occitan, which is on the other side of France, basically.
South,
so
yeah.
The difference is crucial between those two. Do you think it would be possible to pinpoint the location given the few words that we have?
I have actually, some time ago, more than a year ago, I put something on my blog about that. And I did investigate briefly some of the origins of the words. For me, the most convincing is that it seems to be from a southern French, maybe Occitan dialect, but it's not entirely consistent. But again, one thing I've emphasized on my blog is this issue of language variation. And we've got to expect that in that period, for example, in France, there's a huge amount of variation, not only in the way that people spoke, but the way that they wrote. Right. So for me, the debate over whether it's Northern French or Southern French doesn't seem particularly important. If I were pushed, I would say it seems to be closer to the Occitan Southern French version. But for me, that in itself doesn't really get us very far, because it could have been an Occitan French speaker who was living, say for example, was a monk in Austria, or was a monk in Italy, or was a monk in Istanbul. It doesn't really give us much information as to where the Voynich manuscript was at any particular point in time. So although it's interesting and intriguing, I don't think, unfortunately, that it takes us very far to understanding where the Voynich manuscript itself came from, or any details of the script or language of the text. Right, but nonetheless, it's an interesting side issue. And for me, I mean, that's another really good reason for saying that the manuscript is an authentic medieval manuscript which traveled around a lot. And that was just used. One of the, exactly, it's been used, rather than, say, being a modern hoax.
Right, exactly.
But that's as far as I would take the discussion of the French.
Right, and even if we could find an exact match somewhere, it could only tell us where the manuscript went after it was made, and we still wouldn't know for sure if it was made in that location.
No, but equally it might only tell us where the writer of those words went. It may be that the manuscript stayed fixed in a place, and the writer was a visitor from another part who came and happened to write in his own or her own version. So it doesn't really help us that much, although again, it's one of the fantastic fascinations of the manuscript.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, Stephen, I think there's a great deal of confusion about your decipherment of the 10 words within the manuscript, as people put it. My understanding of your paper is that you're not claiming to have translated anything, but instead you've identified 10 likely nouns within both paragraphs and labels, which you assume identify the accompanying images. You have then assigned the sounds to these 14 syllables contained within the words, and discovered that the sounds correspond within these words, indicating that the words probably can be pronounced and that they are real words. This makes it likely that these words are nouns which can then be transliterated into their English equivalents, which you're doing by identifying the accompanying images next to the text. But you're not proposing either a language or a translation. Is that a fair summary of your work?
To some extent. It's a little bit, you've implied that basically we identify words and then we break them down up into sounds and symbols. It's actually a little bit back and forward. To some extent you identify sounds and symbols, then you build up the words. But a good example would be the word which might be the word Taurus, to identify the 7 sisters the 7 stars on the famous page with the smiley moon. Basically, if you look at that and you say to yourself, well, this looks likely to be the 7 sisters, the Pleiades, in the constellation of Taurus. So therefore, the label alongside quite most likely represents something to do with that. And if you then say this is probably the word Taurus in one form or another, or it could be the word Taurus, you have to be very tentative at this stage. You then say, okay, the first letter of that might be a t sound of some sort. But you can only then corroborate that if you find other similar matching words through the manuscript where that t sound is also most likely a t. And so you build it up with a process, but each one you do must be speculative and provisional until you get an overarching scheme in which several of them seem to coincide and you seem to see some light. So in that sense, that was in a sense the process that I followed and built up the scheme which is in my 2014 paper. And you can very quickly find the proposed identifications in the appendix of that paper. So yes, just in a sense, your summary is a fair way of putting it. But you're right also that the end result is not an overall translation of the manuscript or translation of the language or the script. It's basically, first of all, a methodological procedure, which we can talk about a bit later, which I think is quite a solid one. And secondly, it does seem to bear some fruit when you then start to match it with other possible words in the manuscript. And the point is then you're actually coming to a decoding of each sign, which should in future allow you to generate other words as you go through the manuscript. But it's a very long, slow and tortuous process. But you're right in the sense that it's not promising, it's not saying, we have now deciphered the manuscript or we have decoded the manuscript or we've found out what the language is. No, it's more a methodological approach to going step by step to identify certain patterns in it in what I think is quite a relatively rigorous and systematic way, and then saying, okay, will this allow us a way of finding out more about the manuscript and the script as a whole within it. So that's all it promises, and it was very specifically identified as a provisional and partial attempt to make some headway. In a sense, what I think is most valuable about that is the methodology behind it. I think it's got some insights and some of the, if you like, decodings of some of the words I would definitely still stand by, although others, of course, might be less solid. But nonetheless, I think it's the methodology which I would stand by as probably the most interesting part of it.
Yeah, I must say, when I started researching the manuscript myself, it was because I read your paper, and it was exactly this methodology that appealed to me. Like, okay, it can be done, and it's probably gonna be done in this way. Even though I don't really agree with all the plans that you use for identification, but okay, that's a whole different problem.
No, that's a valid discussion.
Yeah, exactly. Now you've said that the underlying language is likely Near Eastern, Caucasian, or Asian in origin. Is this still something you think is the most likely?
I would just correct you on that. I wouldn't say that the underlying language is Near Eastern. I think we just don't know at this stage. But what I did say in my paper is that there seem to be elements which derive from Near Eastern, right, Caucasian, or Asian aspects. So, for example, there are elements which seem to come from a Persian origin. But that doesn't mean that the language itself is from those families. It could simply be borrowings. It could be that all of the words that I've identified are actually borrowings into the language. That's very common with nouns. I mean, you think of, almost all the names of fruits and vegetables, certainly exotic fruits and vegetables that we have, derive from other languages.
Especially
think of artichoke or
especially
avocado.
In these scientific contexts, also you get a lot of jargon.
A huge amount of borrowing. So I think we're not very far into suggesting what family of languages we're dealing with. I do think that some of the work by Marco Ponzi and René and others, and Darren Worley, on the zodiac figures, the actual illustrations, suggesting an East European or Central European origin for some of those illustrations, I think is quite telling and convincing, actually. So for me, I would not be surprised if the manuscript was a European production. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the language within it is a European language. I mean, if you just take the example of Romany, sometimes known as the Gypsy language, if, for example, the Voynich manuscript is written in Romani language in a script specifically devised for the Voynich manuscript, well, it could well be written in Europe, but yet the origin of that particular language is far from Europe.
Yeah.
So it could be that we're dealing with something that's quite a mixed and unexpected language, but yet produced within Europe. And so I think that's a possibility, but I certainly would not insist that the underlying language is Near Eastern, Caucasian or Asian. Yeah. I think the jury is still out on that. We still just don't know.
I'd like to begin on the Romani suggestion, because that was not your own idea, I think. It was developed by others on your blog. What is your view on this possibility?
Yeah, I mean, Derek Vogt was a prominent worker on that, and he's produced some nice videos on YouTube about it. And others have suggested it in the past as well. And I haven't ruled that out as a possibility, because, I mean, basically, to summarize some of the other aspects of my paper, as I see it, the most likely language that underlies the script, the Voynich script, is a language which has not been written down before. So as I see it, it's quite likely that a small group of scholars set about to develop a script to encode a language that they communicated in normally, and to transmit the ideas of the time in terms of herbals and other things into that particular group or particular linguistic culture. And if you say, for example, well, could it be Italian? You'd say, well, no, at that period, the Italians already had a script to write their language, and why should they develop another one? So you then start to look for languages which were prominent or strong in one way or another, or which had a significant community of speakers, but yet did not yet have its own script, and therefore needed one to be developed for them. And then you come to things such as Romani or other things. I think another possibility could be something like Hungarian, say, which had a prominent group of speakers, but did not have a strongly used script at the time. And therefore, Romani is not impossible. Because of that very reason, there would have been a need for some group of scholars to create a script for themselves, and therefore they did it, and they then produced it. So I think we can't yet say with any certainty that it is Romani or that it is anything else. We just have still too much work to do to try and establish what it is. But I think the arguments are very interesting, and I really appreciate the attempt by Derek and by others to try hard and push to investigate and then see whether this hypothesis, their particular hypothesis, does hold water. I think that's great when people do that kind of work.
Yeah.
Because one of the things I find interesting is that you've concentrated on the first word of each herbal page, on the reasonable assumption, of course, that this is the word that's most likely to be the name of the plant. That's a pattern that's very common in European herbals that we know about, but do you know if it's common in the herbal traditions of the languages elsewhere outside of Europe? Herbals that might be influencing people?
First of all, let me clarify a bit about the first word of each page. I mean, it's quite perfectly possible that the first word of each of the herbal pages is not the name of the plant. That's quite possible. It could be that it's within, say, the first line, or even the first or second lines. So it's simply one assumption is that we will start by looking at the first word, and actually in the Voynich manuscript, the first word on very many of the herbal pages, the plant pages, does seem to be quite a unique word. So in other words, a relatively infrequent word in terms of the Voynich manuscript. So therefore it could be the name of a particular plant. But that's definitely not an assumption that you must stand by. You look at it and then you say, is this possible, or is this just unlikely? And you therefore explore that. A good example of that is what I call the Centaurea page, which is, I think, folio 2. I'm not sure if it's V or I'm not sure which one it is, but where the Centaurea plant, for me, that's a really watertight identification of the Centaurea plant. I think the plant, virtually nobody has suggested any other possibility. And the fact that the word, the first word of the line of the page, and also the first word of another paragraph further down the page is virtually identical, does make it fairly plausible that this might be, no stronger than that, might be the name of the plant in the picture. And you then this in a sense is speculation, because you simply got one plant, one word, maybe a second word. But when it becomes more interesting is when you combine that with other identifications of other things through the manuscript and build up a system such as the one that I was trying to build up in my paper. So any single identification must be speculative. You can't insist on it. But yet building them up as a pattern is what starts to give it a little bit more credibility. But to come back to your actual question, very often in Western herbals, the first word on the page with the representation of the plant is the name. And that is actually quite common in other herbal traditions. For example, in Arabic herbal manuscripts, very often it's the first word. Not always. Sometimes it's a word later on in the first line, which is then, for example, underlined or highlighted in some way. But again, you are looking for likely words that might be the name of the plant, but we can't insist that it's necessarily going to be the first word. That's just, if you like, the first place you look. But you look at it very, very cautiously and skeptically, and you use your judgment.
Yeah, in another manuscript I've been studying a while ago, you always had, for example, a fixed phrase at the beginning, for example, nomen herba, and then the name of the herb.
Absolutely.
We are unfortunate that such phrases at all do not appear to exist within the Voynich, or do you think
and
that's true?
Particularly we're unfortunate that they didn't somehow highlight the name in a different ink, or in a different, or underlining, or something like that, which they do in some herbal manuscripts. So that leaves us, fighting around to identify, which word it might be.
Yeah. Now, we've been talking a bit about the difficulty of identifying the plants, but that's not really your area of expertise, so we'll leave that for a discussion with a medieval herbalist. But your transliterations, by definition, are heavily based on the imagery. So when you started writing your paper, how did you choose the sources that you selected?
Sorry, for the imagery.
Sorry, there's a lot of noise here. How did you choose the sources? For example, you relied heavily on Sherwood's plant identifications. How did you select those?
I think I really relied on any identifications that I could find of people who seemed to have fairly authoritative arguments for why this plant was the plant that they identified. But also I did look back at other herbals to look at the way in which the plants were represented there, looking also at Arabic and herbals from other traditions as well. Basically, it was an attempt to scour the available information and see what these plants might be, given the fact that as there's a Finnish biologist who's put some really nice discussions on my blog about how difficult it is to identify these plants and some of the factors behind why these plants in the Voynich manuscript might look so peculiar and strange. And taking account of that kind of thinking, and expecting that many of the plants in the Voynich manuscript might not have been seen from life, or they might have been drawn from dead samples or something like that. You've got to use a lot of interpretation to say what this plant might be. But there are some, as for example, the example of the what I call the Kentauria plant, which I think are pretty convincing, and which nobody seems to differ in terms of that being the plant. The interesting one, which I think you may mention at another time, is the juniper, which I've identified as Oror or Arar, which again, many people have said it looks like the cannabis plant. And you have great difficulty being sure what exactly that plant is. So in all of my research and my discussion, there is an element of interpretation, of judgment, of accepting the inevitable variation to do with the drawings, the inevitable variation to do with the script. And it is a slow, tentative process which needs to be built up over a long time. It's not something where you can say, oh, I looked at that plant, immediately I knew it was such and such, and immediately I knew that the language was Hungarian. That kind of too speedy attempt to work through a difficult manuscript like this, I think, is just foolish and doomed to failure. And actually that reminds me of the TLS article which came out recently, which identified can you remember the author of that article?
What was his name?
We can perhaps find it later, but basically I identified it as and basically said that the script was entirely a set of Latin abbreviations.
Yeah, Nicholas Gibbs was his name.
I mean, that for me is an example of what I call pick and mix, where you simply take lots of things from here, there, and everywhere. You say, oh, that looks like that, that looks like that. Therefore, it's taken me 25 minutes and I've identified the manuscript as this. And that for me is just foolish. That's not scholarship. It's not research at all. But the problem is, it is very attractive to online newspapers to publish that kind of thing because they get a huge number of clicks. So it's essentially what you call clickbait. You get a huge number of clicks from people and your advertising revenue goes up.
Right.
But if you spend 10 minutes reading an article like that and you know the Voynich manuscript even to an intermediate level, you realize that it's just not worth bothering with. That's sad.
We were surprised that he got published at all because for us, we see these kinds of theories every day from all kinds of people, and one gets published and it's suddenly all over the internet.
And I think the reason for me is clickbait, as they call it, because they know that as soon as you put Voynich into something, you get a huge number of people clicking on, and you can then say to your advertisers, look, we had 1 million clicks today, and you get more revenue. But I think I agree with you, I think it's amazing that something like the Times Literary Supplement should publish something like that. With so little research. I think it had almost no reference to other work or scholarship in the field.
Even though in the 1990s already some of his ideas have been suggested on the mailing list. And he doesn't refer to anything.
No, I mean these ideas of the kind of Latin abbreviations have been around literally for decades. You look at some of the oldest accounts or analyses of the Voynich manuscript series, and they've been identifying possible Roman abbreviations in there, but they were not cited in the work. I think, it's very disappointing, really, when this kind of thing is given credence, because then, of course, anyone who's trying a little bit more seriously to investigate the manuscript is also seen as some kind of hoaxer or waster, and that's an aspect of the Voynich manuscript in the community which I really just tried to avoid, because I think it doesn't help in the ultimate endeavor of decoding and understanding this fascinating manuscript.
Right. Now that we're talking about the Voynich and the media, you yourself have become almost synonymous with Voynich research. Many people started researching the manuscript because of your paper. How did you experience this? Did you expect this at all, that it would be such a hit?
I think you're very generous to say so, actually. I mean, to some extent, you could say that what I did 3 years ago has been forgotten by lots of people as well, because it is such an ephemeral world, and you get a new fantastic theory which everyone says is the latest one, and they forget what happened even 3 years ago. So although I hope that the approach that I adopted to the manuscript is one that is of value, even if, of course, it sounds like a drill in the background, somebody cutting down a tree. Okay, no, I think that, for example, the methodological approach which I followed, I still would stand by and say I think that's the very best way that we're ever going to make a dent into the script and the language. And also my insistence, which we have to make again and again, the difference between the script and the underlying language is a really important one, because it could be that the underlying language is one that's known to us, but what's stopping us getting there is just the script that's lying above it. And this is a kind of element of the research which many people just don't seem to get, and you get even in the recent discussions on the internet, you get people confusing the issue of script and language quite a lot. But I do think that the general approach, step-by-step steady approach, could potentially bear fruit. And if we look at some of the work that's been produced more recently, I think Marco Ponzi is somebody whose research I really, really respect, and he's done some really interesting stuff trying to identify symbolism using art historical comparisons, to say, for example, that one of the pages seems to represent spring, summer, autumn and winter by looking at the clothing of the different characters depicted on the page. And that kind of thing is really useful and interesting, and well beyond my capacity, as I'm not an art historian, but that kind of thing is really useful and interesting, because then it can lead us to look closely at the words around the figures and say, is there one word here which might be the word spring, another word for summer, another word for winter, another word for autumn. And then using a system such as the one I tried to use in my researches to try and work out what those words might be, how the letters might link with other words and letters in the manuscript, and do it in a very systematic step-by-step way, and then gradually move, and I say gradually over years actually, move towards identifying a possible underlying language. But it is a long, slow endeavor. And the problem with, as we were talking about the media before, is that the media want quick, immediate solutions. They want somebody to say, oh, I had a look at it, I did this, and yeah, wait, whiz bang, this is the solution. This is the answer. But you look, for example, at the decipherment of Linear B in the 1950s. And that was an endeavor that really started seriously in the 1920s.
Right.
And with a very systematic approach, following more or less the same approach that I've been using. It took 30 years to identify the fact that the script was encoding Greek, a language which everybody knew. So it was almost staring us in the face, but because the script was so opaque, it took 30 years of systematic and careful work with a number of different people, and against many scholars in Greece actually insisting it was not Greek, for somebody to show that it was actually Greek. And that took 30 years. So for us to expect an overnight discovery, I think is really, it misunderstands how translation and decipherment works in this kind of case.
I mean, to pick up on your example of the differences between script and language, over here in Spain there's a medieval or late medieval tradition of the Alhamiadas, where the conquered natives, the Arabian speakers of Al-Andalus, when the Christians came in and banned the writing and speaking of Arabic, they weren't allowed to write Arabic. So instead they kept on writing Arabic, but using the Latin script, which was perfectly legal. They also had a very good barrack room lawyer who spotted the loophole in the law. And these manuscripts are, of course, fascinating because you're looking at them and they appear to be written in language we understand, but you have to read them aloud, and then when you read them aloud, they turn into Arabic. And that's exactly the underlying language behind it, but they're just using our script to write their language. So that's a perfect medieval example.
That's a very good example, and I think that also illustrates the fact that in medieval times in Europe, for example, there was a huge admixture of languages and scripts, which actually, with standardization, particularly we in relatively monolingual England, we kind of think, oh, there's only one language, there's only one script, why would anybody mix them? Well, of course, people have been mixing in the way that you described for centuries. So I think you have to see the Voynich manuscript in that kind of context. I remember giving a talk about the Voynich manuscript and somebody put his hand up and said, I think it's in English. And I said, well, why do you think it's in English? He said, well, because that's the only language that I know. And I thought, there's some strange logic going on here, that because English is the only language I know, therefore I'm going to assume the Voynich manuscript is written in English. And that just is a complete failure to understand linguistic diversity and script diversity. And I think you have to approach the Voynich manuscript with that kind of understanding.
Yeah, so I think that's part of the problem of the Voynich. People look at it and it looks common enough for people to start grabbing elements that they identify, and then they build it up on their own personal experiences. And of course, as you're saying, what you have to do is completely eradicate our own cultural references and start afresh with it and start building it up without any preconceptions.
Yeah, I mean, David, I think you, as you imply, I think that's what I call the pick and mix. You pick the thing that you identify, and too many people basically then say, oh, that letter, and people email me literally every week saying this, I hope I'm trying to help you, but I think this letter looks like the particular letter in Korean. And you say, well, okay, you've picked something. But then the danger then is people then stick with that interpretation. Oh, it must be Korean, or it must be Icelandic, or whatever it is. And then they try and force home this conclusion instead of then taking the next step, which is to be flexible and say, okay, that letter looks like Icelandic, that one doesn't. What am I going to do about that? And in your research, you've got to be very skeptical and very critical of your own position, first of all. And everything we say at this stage is entirely provisional. And that kind of skepticism is the only way we're ever going to get forward, as you say, beyond our prejudices.
One thing that contributes to that as well is that actually the script is really easy to read. So it's accessible for people who should normally not have access to such. Because, for example, if you read a manuscript in a cursive script, you cannot even see what's written there. You can, if you have zero experience with manuscripts, I mean. But the Voynich, you can easily distinguish the separate glyphs. You can tell them apart.
Yeah.
But do you think that might also tell us something about the people who made this? Because the glyphs do look similar to Latin glyphs, to the extent that people think they must have been familiar with them.
Again, enough of them do look similar to Latin to make people think, there's a Latin element to it. But yet again, there are enough which are unique and so completely different and have a kind of almost Caucasian or Oriental feel to make us question that as well. I mean, my personal theory, and again, we're completely in the world of speculation here, is that the manuscript is, in a sense, written quite confidently and consistently throughout, obviously in different hands. But it looks to me like this was not, for example, the first manuscript that was written using this script. Because if you've ever tried to make up a script, you start kind of doing things, you change it, you scratch it out, there's not much evidence of that in the manuscript. So it seems to me that the script is probably not in the first stages of development in the Voynich manuscript, but probably say the second stage of development.
So you really want to study it as a product of a culture, really? I mean,
that's how, as I see it. I see it as the way that it's written is confident. You look at take a single page of the Voynich manuscript with one of the herbal pages, and you'll see it's fairly confidently written and quite neatly written, as if somebody is pretty fluent in the production of that text. It's not, for example, so laboured that it must be a copy. Every single letter copied laboriously. There's an element of fluency within the script. So that makes me think it's possibly a second level of development of the script, which they're using to produce a compendium of knowledge for a particular group of people. That's how I see it. Okay. And one theory that I haven't actually yet written out in great detail is if you know the page which has the diagram with the alphabetic, sometimes called the alphabet page, which has the same sequence of characters at least 3 times around a circle. I think is it folio 57, I think, from memory. Yeah.
But I know the one you're talking about.
Where it's sometimes called the alphabet page. There's the circle, and then you have the letters repeated, more or less repeated, not entirely repeated, 3 times around the circle. And what I have not yet written out in any detail, but what I'm quite interested in, is the fact that some of the key, most frequent symbols in the Voynich manuscript are not within that circle. They're not there. Now, to my mind, one possibility about this, which I think has not been thought about elsewhere, is that what has been written down might simply be the consonants only. And that's exactly what you would do with an abjad. In Arabic language, for example, you don't write the vowels down. When you write the alphabet out, you don't write the vowels. You write the long vowels, wa and ya, but you don't write the short vowels. They're added later when you actually write a text. So for me, one possibility is that circle shows simply the consonants of the script, and it misses out vowels. Now you might say, what about the first one? That one that I've identified as an a. Surely that's a vowel. But actually that a is also in the Arabic alphabet because it's an a. It's actually considered a glottal stop, not a vowel. So if, for example, the people devising the script were following an abjad model, they would follow with a as the first one, and then they would continue through with the consonants. But many of the other smaller symbols, which could well be vowels, would be missing from the list that they wrote down. So that's one possibility, which again makes me think that this was a script in some development, and there was some element of play, and some characters that they devised were then not very frequently used. They're very rare characters, and maybe if they'd developed the alphabet further, they would have dropped those and added in others as well. So that is my very informal and speculative take on the kind of stage of development of that of the script as I see it.
Okay. So you think it's an invented language?
No. Again, be very careful about this, David. An invented script.
Sorry. I thought of that. As I said it, as the word left my mouth, I thought I hope he doesn't pick up on that.
No, it's very important. It's a very important difference because I think it obviously is an invented script. There can be no doubt about that. But then all scripts are invented. But if you think about the glagolithic script or any other scripts that were invented for particular communities, or Rongo script in Easter Island, for example, somebody sat down and devised or developed these scripts, as for example with Armenian. Somebody sat down, a monk sat down and developed the script for the Armenians. The language was already existing. The language was there and had been for hundreds of years. But what he did was he invented a script to encode that language. And that is precisely how I see the Voynich manuscript coming into existence. The script is an invented script, but I would still hope to find that the language underneath that script is something that we actually can identify.
But would you agree that the person or persons who invented this script were familiar with other scripts?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's the case with, I think Armenian is a great example, where you had the monk who sat down and we know developed the Armenian script for the Armenian nation and the Armenian language. He borrowed from other languages and other scripts and took elements of the script into the script that he himself invented. But he then made it work for the particular Armenian language features.
Right. So the reason to develop a new script is linguistic, because they think this language is so different from the languages in which the script is usually used, so we need to add new symbols or change the symbols?
Yes, it can be that. It can be a linguistic reason, but it also can be something to do with pride, or the idea that you want your own. You say, we are a proud nation of Armenians. We would like our own script for ourselves. We deserve it. And then it's taken up by a few monks and scholars who write it. And then the people more broadly say, for a national identity, this is going to be our script, and they use it for their it starts to be taught in schools and so on. I mean, for me, the way to understand Voynich is that it was developed by a small group of people for, as you say, particular language need, but also could be reasons of pride or could be reasons of secrecy, for example. They may have been a persecuted group for some reason, and they decided to try and encode their own language in a way that was just for them. So there are lots of possible motivations, but as I see it, in historical terms, the next stages didn't happen. Then either the monks who were using it or the people who were using it died out, or it was simply never taken on. Or another thing could be that the script was so faulty and didn't actually do the job very well that therefore they decided to revert to Latin script.
Yeah.
Or some other script.
That they all stayed under the radar, those documents, and that they are now gone. And that the Voynich, by coincidence, is the only surviving one that we have.
It could be that, and it'd be great if one day we, in some archaeological excavation, we find another sample of Voynich script
with a manual attached to it.
We're dreaming.
A dictionary, a Rosetta Stone. I mean, when we look at the actual construction of the script, there certainly do seem to be elements that point. I mean, one theory I've been looking into for a long time was that it was an early artificial language because of the regularity of the script. If we look into the actual, let's look at the glyphs. The glyphs are very positionally aware. They tend to appear all over the place. And you've picked up on either K, which you've also given the sound value of K, and which you've fixed the word auror. Sometimes the gallows will appear in front of the word auror with the either K. Sometimes it doesn't. How would that fit into your reading of juniper if you think it's a noun? What's that glyph doing? Is it modifying the noun in some way? Or what's I
think the most honest answer to your question is we don't know. That's the first point. And I think we're still grappling with the glyphs or the gallows characters to try and understand what exactly is going on, because they very often appear as the first character in a page, but they very often don't. They very often appear further down the page within another word. They tend to cluster actually towards the top of the page, as it seems, and it seems to be, I think people have mentioned this a lot, that the first line tends to have a proliferation of them, as if there's some kind of decorative element to that first line. And if that's true, that implies actually that the glyphs are sometimes written as gallows characters, but then further down the text they're written as a different character. And that would be interesting and slightly confusing. I think, to be honest, we still are not really sure what these characters are doing. But the identification of auror as the word perhaps meaning arar for juniper is a bit more than that. It's actually looking at the distribution of the word through the manuscript, particularly on the particular page. I think it's folio 16 where I've identified the possible juniper plant. And you'll see that the word auror, as I interpret it, appears in several different places, particularly if you take account of the fact that the R, the final R, seems to be differentiated in the script from the other R when it's at the end of a line. And that's caused some confusion sometimes, because it seems as if I'm saying there are lots of R's in this script, but actually it's a little bit more than that. We can come to that in a minute. But basically, the word auror is identified for other reasons. But then, as you say, occasionally there's a glyph in front of it, which could just, I mean, the starting character in some of the pages could just be a character saying this is the beginning of the page. Could just be a discourse marker or a writing marker to say that. But we can't then be sure about that. And I think it's basically just to say the jury is out on that one. Still needs a lot more investigation, sadly.
Do you think the gallows characters could be similar to the way we use capitals, for example?
Sorry, just give me one pause. I have to put the video for 1 second.
Okay.
Okay, Paolo. Okay, sorry. Yeah. Sorry, Koen, you were saying?
Yeah, so you said that, for example, the gallows, that they could be represented by the same sound could be represented by a different glyph later on. So would that make them similar to the way we use capitals in the beginning of a sentence?
It could be, although it doesn't, to be honest, it doesn't seem like a very consistent thing, does it, if you look at the way that they're used. And also, if you take the alphabet page that we mentioned before, they seem to be there in the list of letters consistently as a single letter, although in fact one of them has a different representation in two of the different manifestations on that circle. So it's not entirely clear. I think I can't really throw much light on that. I think it's still a confusion about it.
Right.
But you're right, David, when you said that in one case, certainly I considered that it was probably the ka, for example, in the one of the early pages that we looked at, did seem to be a ka at the beginning, a ka sound. But actually, that's another interesting point. If you look at the way that the ka symbol in the Roman alphabet, in the middle of the Roman alphabet, you've got a la symbol, which is quite tall, and a ka symbol, which is quite tall. They go above the line in both cases. So it wouldn't actually be entirely surprising if this was a ka with a similar higher level manifestation in the script than in others. But again, that's pure speculation.
Okay, so yeah, as we've said, there has been some critique on your work, notably by Nick Pelling. You may be familiar with him. And yeah, one of his points of criticism is that you map 3 glyphs to the sound R. Is that a correct summary?
Well, I mean, I think Nick Pelling has a very useful function in the Voynich community as what I call a shock jock. Basically, somebody who shocks, and when a new theory comes out, he's always very quick to attack it because he has a lot of knowledge about the Voynich manuscript. But I think one area where he's weak, I think he would admit this himself, is in linguistics. I think his knowledge and understanding of language is, I think, rudimentary, as it seems to me. And I think it's the simple confusion, for example, between script and language, which he often makes when he writes things, is typical of that. But I mean, in the case of the R, I mean, when I read that critique, I almost fell off my chair laughing because, you know, many different languages have 2 sounds in the region of R. Yeah. And a very obvious one, that David, you'll know this, is Spanish. You know, Spanish has pero, meaning but, and perro, meaning dog. Mm-hmm. It has 2 sounds for R in the same area phonetically. In fact, in Spanish, they are meaningful, significant differences. You have a r and a r sound, which are quite different. English also has a r and a r. If you look at the Scottish, you talk about Edinburgh, but in English they don't happen to have a meaning difference. But many languages and others have different versions of the same sound. Some of them are then encoded into the script. In Spanish, it's encoded into the script as a single R or a double R. But in another language, they're encoded into the script in different letters completely. Not in the case of R, but in the case of Arabic, for example, you have a da, a the, and a da. So you have 3 sounds in the region of da. Okay? Each one of them is encoded with a different letter, with a different letter shape. So you can see it quite clearly. Now, that's kind of rudimentary linguistic knowledge. So if the Voynich manuscript happened to have 2 letter symbols for an R sound, that would be nothing unusual at all. It just depends on the language that it's trying to encode. Now, the third of them is, in my view, and I've got the letter here, it would be EVA M. Now that one for me is actually a terminal form. In other words, it's a form that's used at the end of words or the end of lines or the end of paragraphs, which is, for me, a terminal form of the EVA R.
Yeah, so there's complementary distribution either way.
Again, somebody who doesn't know anything about linguistics would say, what do you mean a terminal form of, you mean it's the same letter but with a different shape? Well, yes. I mean, again, Arabic is a perfect example of this. Arabic, you have a different shape of the same letter, depending on whether the letter's at the beginning of a word, the middle of the word, or the end of the word. It's the same letter, but it's formed using a different shape. So for me, as an Arab linguist, it's not at all unexpected to find a script where you have, for example, Voynich R is the most common form of Ra through the manuscript, but you have the Voynich, the EVA M as the terminal form, which is used simply as a decorative form to tail off to end the word. And if you actually put that character into, for example, the Voynichese software tool online, you'll see that it hugely comes at the end of words, lines, sentences, and paragraphs. So it does seem to be quite likely that it is a terminal character. And for me, it's a terminal form of the EVA R symbol. So again, that for me is year one linguistics.
Right, yeah.
And for me, now again, I wouldn't say I would, stake my house on it, because all of this needs to be researched and developed. But the fact that it's a possibility, I think, should be indisputable for anybody with some basic linguistic knowledge. So that's the kind of criticism that I don't think Nick Pelling is.
The problem probably that Pelling sees is that if you have to reserve one glyph already for a form of one sound that comes at the end of a word, your glyph set becomes, your sound inventory of your language becomes really small. That's something you hear a lot.
Well, really small? How really small? I mean, if we've got, say, 24, 25 main symbols, that's still perfectly enough for, especially if some of the vowel sounds are not written down, but they're assumed, as with abjad languages. I don't see that as a significant objection, actually. But again, it's all, until we have the full set of sound symbol correspondences, we can't say. But to say that it's a possibility, which is what I was saying, seems to me just plain linguistic logic.
Yeah.
And I can't really give any time or credence to that kind of objection. Yeah, if that objection is supposed to say, the whole scheme is not worth thinking about, then I think that's just a very poor criticism.
Yeah.
Well, I think that indicates that whoever devised the script gave a special prominence to that sound. If they're giving a word termination that's slightly different to the normal one. I mean, as you say, in Arabic, there's several different versions.
Sorry to interrupt you, David. I think actually there are quite a few other symbols which could be terminal forms. I mean, if you look at a page of the Voynich script, very often at the end of a word, you'll see a flourishy one that goes down a little bit in one way or another. And I think there could be quite a few which are flourishes to indicate the end. And that, for me, as an Arabic linguist, is a very normal feature. And the way you write Arabic, very often at the end of it, there's a character which kind of flourishes. The form of a symbol which is elsewhere not with a flourish is done with a little bit of a flourish.
Yeah, the one that looks like a 9 is like an A with a flourish, basically.
Yeah, I've seen really interesting, exactly, that's a really good example. I've seen really interesting discussions saying that what I see as the A symbol, which, let me just give you the EVA equivalent. Yeah, EVA O, could have the symbol that looks like a 9, which is EVA Y, as a flourished version of it. And I think that's an interesting argument. Sorry, David, I interrupted you.
No, I mean, you answered my question, so that was perfect.
Okay, good.
But to say that, I mean, one thing that's often mentioned is the line as a functional unit.
Yes.
Which was first mentioned in the 70s, wasn't it, by Courier? Which, again, it says that glyphs are functionally aware. So you're saying that is symptomatic simply of what we've just been discussing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite interesting, this line as a functional unit. Yeah, you could say that if you see that, for example, at the end of lines, there are flourishes in terms of the script. But again, you've got to be a little bit careful with that. The line might be a functional unit in terms of the script. In other words, when the scribe gets to the end of the line, they say, I'm at the end of the line, I'm going to give a nice flourish for the end of the line. But it doesn't mean it's necessarily a functional unit in terms of the meaning underlying it. It could be a decorative element. So it could be that basically it's simply a paragraph of text, meaningful text. But in order to decorate it, at the end of each line, they make some kind of flourish. So it could be that when we look at it, we say, oh, this line is a functional unit. But if we then assume it's a functional unit in terms of meaning, we're making a mistake. It could simply be a functional unit in terms of script, in terms of decorative features on the page. But yet the meaning just continues in the paragraph as a whole. So again, that's something we shouldn't hold too tightly to in our interpretation of the text.
And that is the problem with the statistical analysis of the text. We get so tied up with saying, well, this glyph appears here, and we don't consider it in the way that you're formulating.
Yeah, and David, David, let me add to that. Sorry, I'm getting... I mean, I think you're absolutely right that the statistical analysis of the text, people pay a lot of heed to this. For example, it seems to follow Zipf's law and this kind of thing. But until we actually understand what each of these symbols means and is, we can't really transliterate it properly and then analyze it successfully. And the example that I've mentioned on my blog quite a few years ago, 2 years ago, I think, was the example of the minims. So in Latin script, you have a little slash for the letter I, but you then might put two of them together for the letter N, and three of them together for the letter M, without joining them as we do now in our script. So you then have three little slashes on the page, three minims as we call them, and actually you're representing one sound M or one sound N for two of them. And then you start to say, well, actually, how many letters do we have? When we see in the Voynich manuscript 3 minims, or three little lines, how many letters do we have? 1, 2, 3? We don't know. Until we know that, we can't really transliterate it accurately in a form that will allow computer statistical analysis on the text. So right from the very beginning, we're stuck in terms of proceeding forward with an accurate analysis. So that's why, for me, we still need to do a lot of work at the level of the script itself before jumping to big conclusions about the statistical features of the text.
This is actually something I've seen Nick Belling write about as well, so this is at least something you guys agree about. Now, about the line as a functional unit, I've been reading the work of Emma May Smith. She's also a linguist, Voynich researcher. She says that Sandhi effects might be at work there, which is, for example, when you're speaking, that you and you link two words by inserting an extra sound. So, for example, like in English, if you say the idea is, you insert an R. That the person who wrote the Voynich was uncertain about how to write his language onto the paper, and would insert Sandhi effects only at the end of a line. Do you think something like that, like some linguistic reality, might be at the basis of the line as a functional unit? Or it's purely a script
possible
thing?
No, it's perfectly possible. And I think the larger point you're mentioning, let's take, for example, the example of Turkish. Now, Turkish at the moment is what they sometimes call agglutinative. So it means you take a word, you add on lots of little pieces, and you end up with a very, very long word. So you write it down as a single long word with lots of elements
like
within it.
Or for example.
Finnish, for example. But you could equally write that. You could, if you were developing a new script for Turkish, you could write it out as 7 different words separately. Now, we don't know the nature of the underlying Voynich language, and we don't know how the script writers, if you like, decided to encode it. And it might be that when we find that they've actually separated things which we would now see as a word into 2 words on the page, or they've joined things together and lumped them together. What we would see as 2 words, they put them together as 1 word. So again, we're at very early stages in terms of trying to understand what this script is actually doing. But I think we have to approach it with that kind of sensitivity to how languages are encoded into scripts. And in the example that you just gave, there is an element of variation which we have to expect. I think that means, a job of at least 10 years of trying to unpack and unpick what's going on with the script.
Right, and especially if the culture was in development, the writing culture, then we can expect even more of these irregularities of spoken language.
And another hint is that if this writing system did not catch on, it could be because the script is a little bit defective, as I hinted before, a little bit defective in representing the underlying language. And they said, well, actually, let's go over to Cyrillic script, or let's use Latin script instead. And therefore, the script was basically abandoned. So, I mean, there are these possibilities. It could be that the script is quite defective, as you hinted in your question, actually, is defective in representing the underlying language. It misses out things, it combines things together, and so on. And therefore, that's one reason why it was not used extensively afterwards. That's just a possibility. So it could be. And that adds another problem in how it worked to decode it. Because if it's a really poor, defective script, in terms of representing the underlying language, then it's a huge difficulty to decode it.
But it must have worked to some extent, because they wrote basically a few hundred pages in them. So.
Exactly, and also, if Courier's right that there, and I think he is right, that there's more than one hand writing it, then obviously more than one person was involved, and therefore that implies an element of success. Yeah, you're right about that.
Okay.
Courier also suggested that there were different dialects within the book, the famous Courier languages. Is that something you've seen evidence of?
Well, again, I think that needs to be grounded a bit more in linguistic reality. First of all, there's no reason for saying that they need to be different dialects. It could simply be script variation. So say, for example, William Shakespeare himself, we have a number of examples of his signature. Each one spells his own name differently. He spelled his own name differently in his own signature as a mature, literate person. Okay, so there's no reason for thinking that the Courier A scribe was writing exactly the same language as the Courier B scribe, but there was just enough variation, especially if it's a newly developed script, that they wrote things slightly differently, each one consistent to themselves. So you can see the pattern of the A scribe right the way through the document, the pattern of the B scribe through the document, but they're actually just writing in exactly the same language with script variation. Now, I don't think Courier was enough of a linguist, if you like, to appreciate that. And basically, when he said language A and language B, I think that's really confused a lot of people. I think you can interpret what you see in the manuscript as simply script variation without going to say that they're different dialects or languages.
Yeah,
that's how I see it.
Courier himself did express himself carefully, but of course its terms take on a life of their own.
I think you're right. That's true. But I think he did say language A and language B. Which I think is a really, that's a hostage to fortune. I think that's caused a lot of confusion. I would definitely not say language A and language B. I would say at the very most script version A and script version B. That's the furthest I would go.
Right.
Certainly, I would not, as we said right earlier on, David, I would not invoke any language. I'd speak in terms of script until we get some further idea of what the language is underneath it.
Yeah. No, I was just using his terminology.
No. Of course you were. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well.
Poor fella.
But to take a slightly different angle on this, a lot of the words appear to be made up of stems with prefixes and different sort of suffixes. Kaidane, which you say is centaur, which Dane appears all over the manuscript. Sometimes it's got KY on the front, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it's got different prefixes and suffixes. What do you think about this reuse of the stems in this way? It's not something that we're used to when we look at other sorts of natural languages.
Well, is that true? I mean, you look at English words, and very often they're made up of different parts, which are then, I mean, I'll just look at the word catalogue, say. You've got the word cat, you've got the word you've got the word log, you've got different parts of it make up a word itself. And this was a criticism, I think, that came from Pelling's thing as well. And the idea that, for example, the word catalogue can't be a word because the word cat exists in the language already just seems to me illogical. Now, I mean, I take your point about the stems. There's been a lot more work, of course, on the stems and the affixes. And people are trying to say that there are different patterns there. But again, I don't myself, as a linguist, see this as a particular issue. I mean, you could have the word that I read as kentaur, as a perfectly acceptable word, and then the word taur or daur or whatever as another word that's used somewhere else in the language very frequently. And that, for me, is not a particular mystery. I think languages do that a lot. I mean, your point about it looking a bit odd to English speakers, that's also true. But a language like Arabic, for example, has a lot of basically it has a root form, often made up of 3 root letters, and then around it additions and subtractions at either end, and sometimes infixes, so you'd have something in the middle of the root as well. So for me as an Arabic linguist, I don't really see much of a problem with this idea of a particular roots, stems, additions, affixes here and there, even infixes. I don't really see that as a difficulty. I think this is just an issue to do with the script we still have to work our way through. But I wouldn't, for example, take that as a reason for saying, no, this is not a real language, it must be something else. I think it's just yet another of those intriguing problems that we need to work through systematically.
You think it might have to do something with tonal languages, because there you get a lot of homonymy. If like the same words set to us has like completely different meanings because they pronounce it on a different tone. Do you think it might have something to do with that?
Not really. I mean, the difficulty with that is then they would have to signal somewhere that, as they do, for example, when they transliterate Chinese, they have to signal somewhere that this particular form of the word ma is different from the form ma or whatever. They'd have to signal, and the script, the Voynich script, doesn't seem to signal that kind of thing in any way, which means it would be impossible to read it. So I think that's probably less likely. I wouldn't myself go down the road of thinking it encodes a tonal language unless we have more evidence for that.
Okay.
What about repeating words? Quite often you get words that are either repeated or they seem to be very similar. And then there's the effect of Tim's pairs, which is one word above and then a very similar word underneath.
Yeah.
Tim himself, Tim wrote a very interesting paper arguing that this showed that the whole thing was a nonsense script. Mm-hmm. But again, is this something we see in natural languages, this sort of effect? I mean, if we're writing down...
No, I mean, it is an interesting fact, and a rather odd fact, that you occasionally seem to get several words repeated. But it could be, I mean, there could be elements of literary embellishment, for example. You could have, again, we don't know. It's very difficult at this stage to say much about it. But I think it could be aspects of embellishment. I mean, I haven't entirely gone away from the idea that there might be a poetic element to it. And, you know, coming back to the line as a functional unit, I mean, there are examples of even herbals written in poetry, some quite interesting examples. And it could be that there are elements of poetic embellishment which allow for repetitions or kind of elegant repetitions where, with slight subtle changes here and there, which could be explained in that way. I mean, there are aspects of the manuscript which you would like to say include some kind of artistic elaboration. I mean, we might agree that the illustrations are not very fine artistically, but there are elements, for example, as we said before, some of the letters are embellished in interesting ways. And you could argue that maybe underneath it, there's some sort of embellished language which has a poetic dimension to it, which could account for some of the repetition. But again, it's not something that worries me very much in terms of, I think these things happen in manuscripts. And B, it's not something that I would then say, okay, because of that, I'm not going to assume it's a language, I'm going to assume it's something else. I think that would be staking much too much on that point. I think it's a very interesting feature which we still have to work through.
Yeah, but by coincidence, we've just been discussing this on the forum, and there are also languages which, in their structure, use a lot of reduplication. For example, for forming plurals, for reinforcing. So, yeah, exactly. It's as you say, you need to know a lot about linguistics and know all the possibilities to be able to see, like, okay, it may be possible in a normal language setting.
Sure, but I would agree with the people who raise the issue that it's still a live issue, because there are some places where it seems to be, 4 or 5 repetitions of the same or very nearly the same word, which is a curiosity. And until we get to crack it, it's something that is still a bit mysterious. I wouldn't basically say, oh no, it's not worth thinking about entirely. I think it is an interesting issue, but yet for me, I would kind of park it and say, let's try and work away and find out what's going on, and then we'll see if we can explain this at a later stage.
Okay.
When you, as an interest, when you're looking at the book, and you're working on this, are you using the EVA transcriptions, or are you working directly from the text on the page, or do you ever use the transcriptions?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think, and I think great credit to the people who develop the transcriptions. It's a great help. But I do tend now, actually, to look more directly at the script itself, at the original, because I'm slightly worried, the thing we mentioned before about the minims, I'm slightly worried that we might be missing things in the transliteration. And if we only go via the transliteration, we might actually miss features of the text itself. So I think it's very useful to have the original text and the transliteration side by side and basically make sure that you're looking at both of them, and both of them with caution, actually. But I mean, to the people who transcribed it, I think incredible job, really.
Do you actually still study the manuscript often?
Yes, I work less on it because I'm still obviously in full-time employment doing other things, but yeah. I work less on it than I have been recently. Partly also I've had some health issues which I'm just recovering from, but so I'm not so lively in terms of putting things on the net as I used to be, but I still follow it keenly, and I follow also your own site actually, but I haven't ever posted anything on there. I mean, one thing I'm quite keen to do is to avoid, if you like, Voynich flaming and Voynich. Yeah. In a sense, also, I think we all know that there's a danger of trivia overtaking our busy lives, and we've all got other things to do. So I tend to try and avoid that kind of discussion where it's kind of too nitty-gritty and so on. Right. But I do read them and follow them with great interest.
My impression is that many people have gotten to a point where they discuss more each other than the actual manuscript. So yes. That's what you want to avoid, basically.
I think so. And I mean, what I would hope to do is sometimes to have a block of time where I'd be able to sit down and work on the approach to the manuscript, which I see as the most fruitful one, and to try and take some things a little bit further in that direction. And that's how I'd hope to do it. I think, in a sense, what this manuscript needs is some long period of careful, detailed analysis, working through possibilities, which is, I mean, that's how I got to my 2014 paper, was working for 6 to 8 months. Obviously, I was working full-time as well, but I managed to devote a lot of time, evenings and weekends to it, and a lot of library time in the British Library, actually looking at manuscripts and other documents. And if I were able to reproduce that, I feel I might be able to make some progress that satisfied my own curiosity in the manuscript a little bit more. But I think I'd rather spend the time doing that than, for example, spending hours and hours on forums discussing things which have already, in many cases, been discussed. I mean, I would say every 2 weeks somebody emails me and says, I think I found something really interesting. I found the word Mars in one of the zodiac pictures, which must be the word March. Yeah. Is this not a major discovery? I have to say, well, sorry.
You can copy paste your standard answers already.
And there is a danger of us spending a lot of time on things which have already been done. And I mean, I'm very happy for new people to come in and to find things, but just personally speaking, I don't really have the time to devote to dealing with those things in that way. I think, in fact, a forum such as yours is a fantastic information source for people to get gentle reminders of, you know, where they can find things, where they can, so they keep interested, they keep motivated, they're not put off. There's not a kind of gatekeeper syndrome, but yet at the same time the community as a whole helps them to develop it without any, you know, one or two people being devoted full time to correcting these things or adding to what people have said.
Yeah, I think the most genuine amateurs who are working on the Voynich manuscript, we're not really doing it to solve the Voynich. What we're doing is we're furthering our own knowledge of something that fascinates us, which is medieval life.
I'm trying to solve the Voynich, David.
You will.
And well, I mean, again, Marco Ponzi is someone I've been in communication with for some years. I think is a really good example of somebody who devotes a lot of time, because that's his interest. He's interested in old manuscripts, in symbolism and these things, and he's somebody who's researched very carefully, systematically and calmly, I think genuinely progresses our understanding of what's going on with the Voynich manuscript. But again, you know, that's something that you know, we can draw on over the years to come. I do think this is an endeavor which is not going to be cracked quickly. I think it's something that is going to take us some long time still to do, but that kind of patient and careful work by lots of different people, I think can help to add to the overall progress of it.
And how? But yeah, so exactly, like many different people are doing, ideally are contributing small blocks to the solution, probably, maybe. But how would you see that coming to like one synthesis? Like, wouldn't there be a need for someone at some point to say, like, look, we've got all this now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm biased, but I think the only solution really is through the language. I would say that because I'm a linguist, but I mean, I think that very often I see a really interesting account of, for example, a particular page with particular symbols and saying X, Y, and Z, and I think to myself, yes, but you haven't even mentioned the script on that page. And one thing I admire about Marco Ponzi's work is he looks very carefully at the symbolism, at the picture, the imagery, and then he tries to say something about how that links with the text on the page. And I think unless you do that, we're not going to crack the Voynich manuscripts. I would encourage everybody to try and engage at both levels, both the symbolism and, as far as possible, with the script on the page. Even if they make mistakes, fine. At least that will carry us. At least they're trying to synthesize and look at the imagery and also at the script together. And I think that's where the synthesis will come, when we start to make an understanding of both together.
Okay.
Can I make a further methodological point, which I think might be of interest? And this arose by reading that recent article in the TLS, which we discussed earlier, in the sense that it was headlined Voynich Manuscript, a solution. Mm-hmm. And I think one thing we should actually do as the Voynich community is set out in some detail what a solution should actually entail. And for me, if you had the slightest idea that a solution to the Voynich manuscript should be, for example, the ability to take a piece of the text and transliterate it and then translate it into meaningful, intelligible text, that would be an approach to a solution. Now, the TLS article didn't even begin to try and do that. So the idea that anyone should accept a headline of that sort as possibly true seems to me ridiculous. But we as the community, I think, should almost start setting up what is the solution that we will actually, what do we define as a solution? And if someone comes up with a theory and it doesn't even start to meet the criteria of the solution we've identified, we can then say, hold on, you're not meeting these very simple criteria. In fact, that's something I'm thinking of trying to put onto my own blog soon, is what does a solution to the Voynich manuscript, what will it actually look like?
Right.
We haven't got one. We're nowhere near it.
I think we need something like that. And someone like you needs to get behind it, I think, because you have some authority. So if you organize it, then people will recognize it.
Well, I might get together a post about it. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, you probably know about the Turing test. Mm-hmm. The idea that at what stage in the development or understanding of computers could you say that a computer is now, in a sense, communicating like a human being? So the Turing test was a kind of very simple way of saying, okay, if a computer passes the Turing test, then we can say we've reached a really interesting benchmark. Well, I think what we need is something like a Bax test or some sort of test, whereby anyone proposing a solution, they really should have met these criteria before the community even pays it any attention. Yeah. But whether that will actually stop people like the newspapers who want clickbait from actually publishing these things as solutions, maybe it won't stop it. But nonetheless, at least it might allow us some more systematic way of evaluating the solutions that seem to come up every week.
Right.
What we have on the forum is an interesting feature where you can actually ask for your paper to be peer reviewed. So you put it up on the forum in a special area, and ask for people to come and submit their critiques of your paper, which
that's a good idea.
As if it was a peer-reviewed journal.
What a fantastic idea! And I like that as well, because that encourages people to review it in a fair spirit, and in a positive spirit, rather than just everyone posting things here and then everyone else criticizing it and slagging it off and saying, no, that's rubbish, because we all know it's Icelandic.
Right.
So no, I think that's a really good idea, and I think your forum, actually, from what I've seen of it, is a really great innovation, because it's also very well structured and has attracted a lot of interest and people to it. So I think that's a great initiative, and
Thank you very much. A lot of that's down to Koen's hard work in moderating it and beating out certain people with a stick.
Can you answer one question for me? Maybe you know the answer to this. Do you know the Voynich.com site where you can put letters in. It will show you where they come in the manuscript. Who is behind that?
Job. It's a man called Job, but he doesn't really identify himself very much.
No, he doesn't.
He has a personal alias online, and I've chatted to him a few times about things, but I don't know what his real world persona is.
Okay. No, I just think that was such a great.
It's a wonderful website.
Visualizer, and it's so anonymous. I think he deserves credit.
Yeah. But no, that's intentional on his behalf for whatever reason. I think he is a software developer, and he doesn't want the two sides of his business to make. Yeah. He doesn't want all the flaming to start either, and all the suggestions of do this and do the other. But it's on a marvelous website, and it's
very useful.
Clever bit of programming.
Indeed.
All right. Well, one final question as an academic, really. What do you think more academics are starting to come into this world, and they're not going to be afraid? I mean, you were a trailblazer almost in becoming one of the first academics in recent years to publish a paper under your own name. And you stuck your head above the parapet and you took a few shots, but you were the first person to do it for a while. Do you think more people are going to be following you?
I kind of agree with the premise of your question. I really regret the fact that not more. I think we really need more academics, for example, looking at the script, looking at the imagery, looking at the. I think it's such a pity that I was wanting to organise a conference. In fact, this last July, I was planning to organise a conference where I wanted to get specialists in medieval paleography script texts to come along and give their view, even informally give their view about the Voynich manuscript. So many people just refused. And one of them wrote to me the most amazing email. She said, I'm sorry to say I'm just not interested in the Voynich manuscript. I thought, what? You're a medieval scholar interested in manuscripts of around that period. You're not interested in the Voynich manuscript. And I think it's incredible. I mean, I think probably one reason is that in my own case, I don't really, reputation doesn't particularly bother me. It's not something that I'm worried about. I'm just going to pursue what I find interesting myself. And who cares if it's right or if it's wrong? As long as, of course, I'm hedging it as I'm doing as any academic would and saying it's provisional, it's partial, it's just a building block and people. But that's the only way we progress, isn't it? I mean, if an academic is foolish enough to put their head above the parapet and say this is definitely X or Y, and at the same time fail to acknowledge all the other research that's gone on, well, then they're asking for trouble. But what I would like is more serious academics to stand up and actually give us their genuine ideas, with no strings attached, so that we can actually learn from. I mean, one thing, for example, is the script. We've never really got a really good expert on medieval script to look closely at the one and give a really considered opinion. It's such a pity. It would be great. And no, so in a sense, I agree with you. I hope that more people will come forward. I think the carbon dating was really important, actually, because that gave a really strong scientific statement that this manuscript, at least the stuff that was analysed, is actually of a genuine medieval date. And that, because I think many people were afraid if they said something and then it was later proved it was 20th century, then we would all look like idiots. But I think the carbon dating has allowed people to stand up with a bit more confidence and come forward. But I kind of agree with you that the more the better.
Don't you think that is because there's still like this notion that the Voynich was written by a crazy person or was a medieval hoax? That is kind of deterring people, while you are taking it seriously as a valuable historical document. So
I mean, I think there's enough evidence from it linguistically to say that it's. The idea of people who say that it's basically written according to a particular pattern as a hoax for some reason. I think there's enough linguistic evidence to say that that's simply not the case. But that's too much to go into at this stage. But I do think that there's enough in it to say that it's a genuine medieval manuscript which needs work. But I just wish that more people would. I think, to take your question, David, I think more people will start to come forward. We've seen one or two conference presentations, haven't we, recently, on Voynich, which I think is really interesting and exciting. And I hope that more people are encouraged to come forward and have their say. I mean, we're none of us going to be 100% right at the moment because there's so many variables still in play, but at least it adds to the kind of weight of what we're doing and the interest of what we're doing.
Well, that's part of the problem. Every time an academic publishes something serious, then everyone jumps on it as if it's the definitive solution published by someone who no.
Or, I mean, yeah, you're right. They either jump on it and say, this is the holy grail, the answer, or they jump on it and say, oh, it's a complete load of rubbish, let's ignore it. And probably the answer is somewhere in between. Like, for example, even the article in the TLS that we were discussing a little while, I think there's some really interesting insights in that, particularly comparanda of different manuscripts that the writer knows about. It's not the solution, and there are lots of problems with it, but there's still some elements, some nuggets in there of interest which we should take account of. And I think we should move towards a point where we take these suggestions at the right level. We don't overdo them or underdo them, and we take from them some benefit, as they obviously have some benefit for us.
Well, I'll tell you what, Professor, you hold your conference down here in sunny Spain, and I'm sure a few people will take the opportunity to come down for the sunshine.
Pues fantástico, y lo hacemos todo en español si quieres.
Está bien.
Well, I don't know, Koen, do you have any more questions before the Professor can get back to work?
Well, there was one thing I forgot to answer about your paper, which, I mean, it's a bit out of place now because we were getting to the end, but I will still ask it.
No we could cut and paste it earlier into the interview.
Yeah, we'll do that in post, David. So you have focused on what you basically think are labels, single words, or the name of the plant, but it's if you go from there and you take the sound values that you have proposed and apply them to a whole paragraph, you get a questionable result. Why do you think that is the case? That it's so difficult to just translate a paragraph, even if you have proposed a value for half of the glyphs, maybe, or even more.
Well, I mean, the proposed sound values that I put in my paper is I think not even half.
Mm-hmm.
So we still got a lot more to do. But if you then did put it into a paragraph, you say that what would come out would be gobbledygook. Well, no, what you'd come out with is a very partial representation of a language that we still can't identify. So of course it will look like gobbledygook. The test will be, of course, at the end of the day, if we can identify more and more sound symbol correspondences and actually build up to, let's say, 85% of the whole of the manuscript, then if you did it, you could start saying, okay, can we now, with an understanding of different languages, start looking to see where the key thing will be, of course, when you can use the sound symbol correspondences that we've got and apply it to say, for example, one of the star labels, and suddenly you say, aha, okay, this really does look like the name of a star. Then you start to say it's becoming productive and valuable. But we're still a way away from that yet. Although people like Derek, for example, have tried hard to argue and show that it does actually work productively for some of the star labels. But I think you're right. We still have to do some research before we can move from the individual words onto the sentences, paragraphs, and so on.
There's also the case like people will say oh, it can't be natural language, but natural language, then they are thinking about, for example, a Latin prose text, for example, but it could be language in a form we're just not expecting.
Yeah.
Like poetry.
Or say, for example, you put an Armenian text into Google Translate, and you translated it into English. Okay. Or no, you transliterated it rather. So you didn't translate, transliterated it into Latin script. Okay. Then you took out 50, 60% of the letters. Okay. And you made the assumption that it was actually a pretty poor representation of the real language. What you would get would be gobbledygook.
Right.
But actually what it would be Armenian but messed up.
Yeah.
So if you reversed it, you'd get that. So I don't see any issue. I think that with the Voynich, I think that we're still at a stage of ignorance where we can't really do that with any productive hopes.
Do you actually think it could be something like that, transliteration? So, for example, that they saw text written in a script they weren't used to, and they tried to transcribe it to a script that was more easy to read for them?
Could be. absolutely could be. Yeah.
Okay.
But as I said, I think the final message I would give about this is that we have to go, unfortunately, slowly, surely, methodically, and we have to throw away pick and mix approaches, which is what we've seen a lot too much recently, where somebody picks a few things and says, it must be Icelandic, it must be ancient Norwegian. I think that kind of pick and mix, we've got to throw it out. We just got to focus very slow, very sure, very systematically, proceeding step by step. And I think, aim for a kind of 10, 15-year window. Yeah. That's how I see it. And I'm sorry if that comes across to the newspapers and the media as a rather boring, slow approach. But I think that's genuinely the only way that we're going to make progress on this manuscript.
Okay. What is the next step for you on your Voynich research? Do you have any concrete plans, or what would you like to do next?
As I said, I'd like to sit quietly in a well-lit room with books around me, and basically work a little bit more systematically on the same approach that I was using before.
Yeah.
Using some insights that other people have made about what certain of the pictures might mean, and then trying to map the sounds in that way. Basically trying to follow a similar approach. But I would like if somebody would pay me a lot of money, I would retire and do that tomorrow.
We all would.
But I think that would be that for me is my personal next approach. But also at the same time, not still looking at the forums, looking at what other people are doing, because every so often you get somebody new coming into the field who really does have a really interesting new insight on something. And I've read several things on the internet. I think, that's a really interesting approach. Mark, I've mentioned as well, and some of the ones on your forum as well I've seen are interesting. And I think that does inspire you, doesn't it, to take it forward to the next step. But can I ask you, both of you, what are your ways that you would think of going forward with it?
David, you're waiting for me to... I personally think that, like I said before, that for example, we do need a test to be developed for people to test their theory, for example. But we need some form of, someone like you, for example, someone with some authority to present that test, because otherwise it will just drown in someone's site, or it has to become more standard in a way.
Well, I've been thinking since that TLS article. I've been thinking of that such a thing should be said on. I'll try and prepare something and put it on my blog in the next few days, and then I'd welcome discussion on your forum of people of how they think it could be improved.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the only way forward is to try and create a community, a serious community, and drag Voynich research out of the realm of the crackpot, where it's languished in the 80s and the 90s, unfortunately, and try to create some serious discussion about it, and try to create an ambience where more professionals come in and feel confident to talk about the book.
Yeah,
I think it's the only way forward, really.
Yeah,
I'm with you on that one.
Yeah. Right. Well, Professor, it was an honour and a pleasure to talk to you today.
Very welcome. Do you have on your forum any kind of Q&A areas where you, like for example, the Reddit forums, where you have a kind of live discussion possibility where people can throw questions and answers?
No, although we could set one up. What we have is a questions to expert section, where people can formulate very well-defined questions, and anyone who feels that they're an expert in that field can take a stab at responding to that question. But that's not a live feed in the way that you're discussing it. But if we had a professional who was willing to come in and do that, that's something we can easily set up. Yeah. So it's not it's not technology that's missing; it's the answerer.
Yeah. No, I was just thinking that I'd be happy to, if people see this video and want to ask questions or I'd be very happy to kind of do a follow-up and talk things through.
We would post a thread about it, and
I'll look out for that, and then I'll join in.
Yeah, okay, that would be great.
Great.
Yeah, well, sounds great.
Thank you for your time, and thank you for your work on progressing things.
Thank you very much indeed.
Speak to you again.
Speak to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.